Hi, I'm Julia Roberts, President and CEO of BRAC USA, and today we've been talking about investing in women. It's known that the most powerful way to move people out of extreme poverty is to invest in women. And so we're asking our donors and our supporters here today to help us multiply her power. And one of the ways in which BRAC multiplies her power is through social enterprises. So it is my absolute pleasure to be sitting here with my dear friend and colleague, Tamara Hasan Abed, who's the Managing Director of BRAC Social Enterprises, to talk to us about how social enterprises are helping to invest to multiply her power. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Julia.
Okay, so I have a few questions I'd love to pose to you. And the first is, I've recently heard you talk to a group of students about the way in which BRAC selects social enterprises and how and why they go into each of the areas or sectors of the social enterprises. Can you explain a little bit about BRAC's approach about deciding on a social venture and how and why you make those decisions?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So with social enterprises and BRAC, what we essentially do is we do the same kind of work we do with our development programs through social enterprises. So it's a different type of intervention, but to address the same problem of poverty, alleviation, and empowerment of the poor. And what we do is we identify a social problem that we feel that we can solve through market-based methods. And then we pilot, test, and then we go for scaling. But it's always to solve a social problem. So we're not sort of initially looking at, what could become a big enterprise or, what could give a certain amount of returns, but it's always focused on solving that problem. But through market-based methods, of course.
No, absolutely. And I think that we've talked about it a lot in the past in the sense that you want it to solve a problem, but through a way in which can be sustainably, right?
Exactly.
And that there can be a way in which you can use profits from one to help subsidize in another to make sure that you're growing reach to like the hardest to reach populations. And so I've always felt that that's very different. I think some people feel that social enterprises sometimes are a focus on building profit that will then do social good. But in social enterprises at BRAC, both the social enterprise and the profit do good, right?
Absolutely.
They're both driving impact.
Absolutely. And as you said, the difference is that with development programs, there's a finite amount of time and you have certain targets, but then the program ends or the grant ends. But with social enterprises, one can carry over one's lifetime, the livelihoods that you create through social enterprises, because it's a going concern. So there's obviously that advantage.
Continuity. Well, and it's actually interesting that you mentioned grants. So, and I think, I've also heard you talk about this too, about the power of grant and patient capital, like the power of philanthropy in social enterprise. Because I think a lot of times people think that grant money or philanthropy is very, very different from the way in which we should be investing as partners and donors to social enterprise. Can you speak to it a little bit about the play of philanthropy and the important role it can have in furthering social enterprise?
Sure. So as you know, BRAC runs some large social enterprises in the agro sector and handicrafts and all of that. When we started doing social enterprises, all of these enterprises needed some amount of grants. So to start off and to fine-tune the model, to iterate and also to get to a certain scale, it needed some grant funding. And then social enterprises also need patient capital. So one cannot look at investing just like how commercial ventures or commercial funders would look at investing. So, we always say that patient capital or impact investing should go to places where commercial capital wouldn't normally go. If it's the same kind of place and you have the same demand for returns, then commercial capital can do that anyway. Then what's the point of having impact investment, right? So the whole idea is you need to be more patient, to give it a bit of time. But once you do that, then it can compete in the private sector just like any other commercial enterprise. But it's very important to recognize that it needs a little bit more time to get there.
Yeah, and I think it's actually interesting to hear some of the stories in which the social enterprises that BRAC developed actually created a market that wasn't there before, right? And crowded in other partner players and private sector partners because BRAC was able to prove that it was a sustainable model. It did have a business approach to it, even though it had a social solution at the heart of it.
Absolutely. If I can just add, Julia, so what you're doing with social enterprises usually are enterprises that which are coming up with newer ideas to solve problems, right? Because if a model already exists and a lot of people are in it, that's not really a problem that you need to solve. That's already being done and all of that. So because it's newer areas or newer ideas or newer population, newer markets or subsector development, value chains. So that's why it takes a bit of time.
Agreed.
And you can't sort of, a normal commercial venture would be, an investor would put in money where there's already a lot of scope for profit.
Or demand.
I mean, if that was already there, then of course, you wouldn't need a social enterprise.
And that's why the problems are still existing, right?
Exactly.
Because the solution hasn't been invested in. So over your tenure at BRAC Social Enterprises, you've met probably hundreds of incredibly amazing women entrepreneurs and seen a lot of development, right? I mean, the clients that you're serving, the people that work in your enterprises. Is there one that kind of comes to mind when you think about the trajectory and the impact that social enterprise also has on the person?
Sure. I mean, I know so many stories over the last few years. I can tell you about a woman I met recently. She's been working with our craft enterprise for many years now, but I was in the field recently and I bumped into her again and she told me sort of how she was doing now. I remember when I first talked to her, she was a woman who was married off very early, I think at the age of 12 or something like that. And then she was abused because her husband wanted to go abroad, was pressing her to get money from her father so he could migrate abroad for a job. And then, her father couldn't afford it. She got abused domestically while she was pregnant with her son. And then she was basically kicked out of her husband's house because she couldn't, cough up the money in time. And then she came across one of our production centers, which makes crafts that then links to our Aarong, which is our largest social enterprise, which is a handicraft chain. But so she came to this foundation and she started working, and she used to work 14 miles from her home to actually get there. And she raised her son that way. And recently when I met her, she told me that her son is now a veterinarian, and he drops her off to her work in a motorbike that he owns. And she's also bought 16 decimals of land. So there are stories, countless stories like this of people changing around their lives and, being able to sort of actually become the owner of assets and somewhat of a determinant of their own lives and futures.
Absolutely, and I think even you've told me about this story and others before, and it's the 20, 30 years in which they're part of a social enterprise. It becomes the fabric of their family,
Absolutely.
The fabric of their community.
Absolutely.
It's just, we both have sons. I hope that my son would be willing to drop me to work every day.
Yeah.
So the last question I have is, while there's social enterprises in BRAC's ecosystem that are sustainable and that you're not necessarily trying to seek grant funding for or donations for, what are ways in which people that want to be part of social enterprise and multiply her power through that lever, how can they support social enterprise at BRAC?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of newer social enterprises that are coming up in BRAC International in our African countries where we work. And I know, for example, there's a seed enterprise, there's also an enterprise in education, and there's many new ones that will come up because we're looking at social enterprise models for a lot of the problems that can be solved in Africa. So I think there'll be huge opportunities to invest there for women and girls there in Africa.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being with us today and
Thank you.
For sharing your stories with us.